December 1943, the sky over Germany was a frozen hell, torn apart by the crossfire of World War II. For Lieutenant Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe aviation ace with 27 combat victories, that was his territory. Flying his Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter, he had just shot down 2 American B-17 bombers and was returning to base, low on fuel and ammunition. It was then that, below the clouds, he spotted a solitary prey, another B-17, flying dangerously low and slow, a target any novice pilot would dream of encountering. It was Stigler's chance to earn his next decoration, the Knight's Cross, a symbol of heroism in Nazi Germany. He positioned himself behind the bomber, aligned his sights, and placed his finger on the trigger. Victory was certain. But as he closed in for the final shot, something made him hesitate. It didn't look like a combat aircraft. It looked like a ghost. The fuselage was riddled with machine gun holes and shrapnel. One of the engines was spewing fire, and the tail was shattered. The tail gunner was covered in blood, motionless in his glass turret. Through the tears in the metal, Stigler could see the crew inside, wounded, struggling to stay conscious in the biting cold of -40 degrees Celsius. He flew alongside the bomber and looked directly into the pilot's cockpit. There, he saw the face of a young man, Lieutenant Charlie Brown, desperately wrestling with the controls, his face a mask of exhaustion and terror. Their eyes met for an instant that seemed to last an eternity. In that moment, Stigler didn't see an enemy. He saw a man. He remembered his former commander, Gustav Roedle, who had once told him, "You are fighter pilots. If I ever see any of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." For Stigler, firing on that destroyed airplane, with its defenseless crew, wouldn't be an act of war. It would be murder. The decision he would make next would challenge everything he stood for. Ignoring the propaganda, duty, and the chance for personal glory, he lifted his finger from the trigger. He wouldn't shoot. But his decision wouldn't end there. Letting that plane simply fly away meant condemning it to be shot down by another German anti-aircraft battery ahead. In an impulse he himself barely understood, Stigler decided to do the unthinkable. He would become the guardian angel of his enemy. On the morning of December 20, 1943, the atmosphere at the RAF base in Kimballton, England, was one of tension and anticipation. Young Lieutenant Charlie Brown, only 21 years old, was preparing for his first mission as lead pilot of a bomber squadron. His plane, a sturdy B-17 Flying Fortress, nicknamed Ye Old Pub, was his home in the skies. The 10-man crew, most even younger than he, trusted in his leadership. The day's mission was one of the most dangerous, to bomb a Focke-Wulf fighter factory in Bremen, in the industrial heart of Germany. Flying in tight formation for mutual protection, the squadron crossed the English Channel and entered enemy airspace. The plan was simple, but execution was a nightmare. As they approached the target, the sky darkened with clouds of black smoke. It was the dreaded Flak, the German anti-aircraft artillery, unleashing an unrelenting barrage. Ye Old Pub was hit almost immediately. An explosion tore off a chunk of the plane's nose, destroying the plexiglass and exposing the crew to freezing winds. Engine number 2 was struck and began to fail, while engine number 4 suffered severe damage, losing power rapidly. Shrapnel tore through the fuselage like paper, severing hydraulic and electrical cables. Inside the plane, chaos erupted. Sergeant Hugh Ecke Eckenrode, the tail gunner, was struck in the head by shrapnel and died instantly. The radio operator was gravely wounded in the leg. Other crew members suffered injuries from shrapnel and the extreme cold invading the cabin. The oxygen system was damaged, and the morphine for the wounded froze in the tubes. Even severely damaged, Charlie Brown held course. He still had bombs aboard and was determined to complete his mission. Over Bremen, he managed to release the payload, but the plane was already a cripple in the skies. Unable to maintain the formation's speed and altitude, Ye Old Pub fell behind, a solitary and vulnerable target in the German sky. Soon, Luftwaffe fighters appeared. A pack of more than a dozen Bf-109s and FW-191s surrounded the wounded bomber, launching a series of coordinated attacks. The B-17's machine guns, already damaged, responded with difficulty. The plane was hit repeatedly, losing another engine and control of its rudders. It was a miracle it was still airborne. Brown, fighting the jammed controls, managed to put the plane into a steep dive, a desperate maneuver that made it vanish into the clouds and shake off the hunters. Alone, broken, and losing altitude, he flew blindly, believing he was heading toward England, but in reality flying deeper into Germany. It was in this moment of absolute despair that a new German fighter. When Franz Stigler positioned himself alongside Ye Old Pub, he didn't just spare the plane, he made a decision that put his own life at risk. Flying in formation with an enemy bomber was an act of treason, punishable by summary execution if seen by another German pilot or reported by someone on the ground. Stigler tried to communicate with Charlie Brown through gestures. He pointed to the damaged plane and then downward, trying to convince him to land at a German airfield. They would be taken as prisoners of war, but they would survive. Charlie, exhausted and suspicious, shook his head in refusal. He wouldn't surrender his crew. Seeing the American pilot's determination, Stigler pointed north, toward Sweden, a neutral country just 30 minutes flight away. It would be a safe haven. Again, Brown refused, still believing he could reach England. Understanding that the B-17 pilot wouldn't surrender, Stigler made his final choice. He would remain alongside the bomber. He knew their flight path would take them over a coastal German anti-aircraft battery. A lone, damaged plane like that would be shot down in seconds. Stigler positioned his fighter to fly between the B-17 and the coast, making his own plane visible to the troops on the ground. The logic was that the gunners wouldn't fire if they saw a German fighter escorting the enemy, assuming it was a captured aircraft. He was using his own plane as a human shield. For minutes that seemed like a lifetime, the two planes, one predator and its prey, flew together in a silent, surreal ballet. When they finally crossed the coast and reached the North Sea, the immediate danger from German defenses had passed. Stigler approached Charlie's cockpit one last time. He looked at the American pilot, raised his hand in a military salute, and then turned his fighter, disappearing back toward Germany. Charlie Brown was stunned. The enemy, who should have killed him, had just saved his life. The rest of the journey was a nightmare. With only one engine fully operational, Ye Old Pub flew 400 kilometers over the icy sea, losing altitude every minute. The crew, wounded and freezing, jettisoned everything heavy, machine guns, ammunition, equipment, to lighten the load. Finally, they sighted the English coast. Brown located an RAF base at Seething and began a desperate approach. The plane, barely holding together, landed with violence, but it landed. Ground crews rushed to the scene and were shocked. The plane looked like a metal skeleton, so damaged it seemed impossible it had flown. In debriefing, Charlie told his superior officer about the German pilot who had escorted him. The response was cold and direct. "Don't repeat that story to anyone, ever." The order to silence the story of the encounter with the German pilot weighed on Charlie Brown like an anchor. In the military logic of the time, an act of compassion from the enemy was something to be hidden, as it could be interpreted as propaganda or generate unwanted sympathy. Thus, the event was erased from official records, but not from Charlie's mind. He returned to the United States as a hero, but carried a secret that isolated him. He married, had children, and tried to build a normal life, but the past haunted him. He suffered recurring nightmares, reliving not the horrors of combat, but the enigmatic gaze of the Bf-109 pilot. Who was that man? Why had he risked everything to save an enemy? These unanswered questions became the center of a silent trauma. Brown continued his military career in the newly formed U.S. Air Force and later worked for the State Department. He was a respected man, but internally he felt an unpayable debt to a ghost. Across the Atlantic, Franz Stigler also faced his own demons. With the end of the war and Germany's defeat, he found himself unemployed in a ruined country. The Luftwaffe had been dismantled, and his past as a fighter pilot was now a mark of shame for many. He never told anyone about the B-17 he had spared. His superiors would have shot him for treason, and after the war, he feared no one would believe or understand. He kept the secret, but always wondered about the fate of that plane. Had the crew survived the crossing of the North Sea? He never knew. The uncertainty followed him as he tried to rebuild his life. In 1953, seeking a fresh start away from the ashes of Germany, Stigler emigrated to Vancouver, Canada. There he found work as a mechanic, eventually returning to flying as a civilian pilot and entrepreneur. He built a new life, married, and had a daughter, but the secret of that December day remained locked in his memory. 2 lives, separated by an ocean and an abyss of ideologies, followed parallel paths. Both men aged, raised families, and retired, carrying the weight of the same moment frozen in time. Charlie lived with the gratitude and mystery of having been saved. Franz lived with the silent hope that his act of humanity had not been in vain. For more than 40 years, the silence connected them without their knowledge. It was a personal war that continued long after the armistice, a battle fought in the quiet of their own minds. Time passed, but the memory did not fade. In the late 1980s, Charlie Brown, now retired in Miami, attended a veterans reunion. For the first time in more than 4 decades, he felt the need to share his secret. With a trembling voice, he told the small group of former combatants about the German pilot who had escorted him to safety. The reaction was skeptical, but a friend encouraged him. "Charlie, you need to find that man. That story deserves to be told." Those words ignited a new flame in Brown. The search, which he had considered impossible for so long, became his new mission. He started with official channels, writing to the U.S. Air Force and military archives, requesting reports from the December 20, 1943 mission. The responses were discouraging. Many records had been lost, were incomplete, or still classified. Bureaucracy seemed an insurmountable wall. Undeterred, he turned his attention to Germany. He contacted Luftwaffe veterans associations, sending letters and describing the incident with as many details as he could remember. He described the fighter model, the pilot's behavior, and the final salute. The responses were polite but fruitless. Luftwaffe archives had been largely destroyed or scattered in the chaos of the war's end. Finding a single pilot from a single mission on a single day was like looking for a needle in a cosmic haystack. Years passed in fruitless searching. Charlie's hope began to wane. It seemed his savior's identity was destined to remain a mystery forever. Then, in 1989, he decided to try one last approach, more public and direct. He wrote an article for a veterans aviation newsletter called Combat Pilot Newsletter. In the text, he not only narrated the story in detail, but made a direct appeal. "I am looking for the German pilot who spared my B-17. I would like to thank him." The newsletter had a modest circulation, but reached a passionate community of former pilots in the United States, Europe, and beyond. The article was published and mailed out. Months passed without response. Winter arrived, and with it the feeling that it might be too late. That pilot could have died in the war or of old age, taking his secret to the grave. But thousands of kilometers away, in a quiet suburb of Vancouver, Canada, That issue of the newsletter was in a stack of mail, waiting to be read by a man who had no idea his life was about to change forever. On the morning of January 1990, Franz Stigler, then 74 years old, was leafing through the combat pilot newsletter in his kitchen. That's when his eyes fell on a headline that made his heart stop. "Searching for the German pilot who spared my B-17." He read the article once, twice, 3 times. Every detail, the date, the damaged plane, the escort, the salute, matched his memory of that day perfectly. The American pilot, Charlie Brown, was alive. The crew had survived. A wave of emotion he hadn't felt in 46 years overwhelmed him. The question that had haunted him his entire life finally had an answer. His act had not been in vain. With trembling hands, he picked up a pen and a piece of paper. He didn't need many words. He wrote a short letter to Charlie Brown's address, containing only 1 sentence and his contact information. "I was the man." Weeks later, in Miami, Charlie Brown found an envelope with a Canadian stamp in his mailbox. Upon reading the brief message, he felt a shock run through his body. It was him. It had to be. Without hesitating, he dialed the phone number. A voice with a strong German accent answered. "Hello?" Charlie took a deep breath. "My name is Charlie Brown. I was the pilot of the B-17. There was silence on the other end, followed by an emotional exclamation. "My God, it's you! You survived!" That first conversation lasted more than an hour. Franz explained why he hadn't fired. Charlie expressed the gratitude he had held for nearly half a century. They cried together on the phone, 2 old soldiers closing a circle that history had left open. In the following months, they exchanged letters, photographs, and memories. They were 2 strangers who knew each other more deeply than most friends. Finally, they decided they needed to meet in person. The reunion was scheduled for June 1990 in Seattle, during a veterans convention. Charlie arrived first, nervous, leaning on a cane. Franz entered the hotel ballroom shortly after. They spotted each other across the room. For a moment, time stopped. There were no more enemies, just 2 men united by an extraordinary past. They walked toward each other and, without a word, embraced. It was an embrace that lasted decades, a gesture that sealed forgiveness, gratitude, and the end of a personal war. Tears streamed down both their faces. When they finally pulled apart, Franz, his voice choked, looked at Charlie and said the words that would define their relationship forever. "I love you, Charlie." And Charlie replied, "I love you too, Franz." The reunion in Seattle was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new and extraordinary chapter. Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler, once mortal enemies, became inseparable, like brothers reunited after a long and painful separation. They began talking almost every day, their conversations filled with the affection of those who share a unique bond. The story of their reunion quickly spread. Newspapers, magazines, and television channels around the world wanted to tell the incredible saga of the brothers of war. They agreed to share their experience, but always with one condition. The narrative should not be about war, but about humanity. In interviews and lectures, they recounted the episode not as a tale of individual heroism, but as an example of the power of empathy. Franz explained that, upon seeing the wounded crew, he acted not as a soldier, but as a human being. Charlie, in turn, spoke about how that act of mercy taught him about forgiveness and restored his faith in humanity. Charlie introduced Franz to the surviving crew members of Ye Olde Pub and their families. The meetings were deeply moving. Sons and grandsons of the men who were on that plane hugged the former Luftwaffe pilot, thanking him with tears in their eyes. To them, Franz was not a former enemy, but the man responsible for their own existence. Together, the two traveled across the United States and Canada, speaking at air bases, universities, and military academies. Their story became a case study in combat ethics, teaching young cadets that honor and duty often require more than following orders. Stigler's message was always clear. Duty is not just about destroying the enemy, It's about keeping your humanity when everyone around you has lost theirs. Their friendship was genuine and simple. They fished together in Canada, spent winters in Miami, and laughed at life's ironies. "We're too old to fly now, but we can still dream about it," Franz would joke. Their story was immortalized in the book A Higher Call by author Adam Makos, which became an international bestseller. The book solidified their legacy, transforming them into global symbols of compassion in times of war. They showed the world that bridges of empathy can be built over the ruins of hatred, and that a single act of kindness can echo through generations, changing countless lives in the process. Their legacy was not in combat victories, but in the moment they chose life over death. The years of deep friendship gave Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler the peace that war had stolen from them. They lived out the ends of their lives not as haunted veterans, but as messengers of a powerful story. However, time, which had brought them together so miraculously, began to exact its final toll. In the early 2000s, both men's health began to decline. Travel and lectures became rare, but their bond remained unshakable through phone calls and letters. They knew their time together was drawing to a close. In one of their last conversations, Charlie told Franz, "You saved me twice, once in the skies over Germany, and again when you found me and gave me peace." In March 2008, Franz Stigler passed away peacefully in his home in Vancouver, Canada, at the age of 92. The news was a devastating blow to Charlie. He mourned the loss of his brother, the man he had spent his life searching for. Just 8 months later, in November 2008, Charlie Brown also passed away at 87. As if linked by an invisible thread, they made their final crossing just months apart. They were buried in different countries, but their stories were united forever. Their deaths were not an end, but a transformation. Their story, now free from the bonds of time, became a modern myth. The book, A Higher Call, carried the tale to a new generation, which was moved by the proof that humanity can flourish in the darkest places. Aviation museums around the world created exhibits dedicated to the incident, displaying photos of the two pilots side by side, with captions celebrating their improbable friendship. The case continues to be studied in military academies not as an anomaly, but as a model of moral conduct to aspire to. The story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler remains a beacon of hope in a world still marked by conflicts. It reminds us that behind the uniforms and ideologies, there are human beings. It reminds us that true courage is not always in pulling the trigger, but sometimes in choosing not to. It is a lesson about the strength of forgiveness and the redemptive power of empathy. Decades after that frozen encounter in the skies, the warmth of that gesture continues to warm hearts, proving that a single act of compassion can, indeed, change the world, one life at a time. War made them enemies, one gesture made them survivors, and peace made them brothers, leaving a legacy that will fly forever.